Hello, yes, we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our monthly session, Self-Publishing Advice Poetry. Yes, we're talking about poetry again and how to self-publish your poetry successfully. And tonight we're talking about how to get paid for your poetry, two topics that are not very often put together, money and poetry. And I am so delighted to have with me here Trish Hopkinson. Hi, Trish.
Hi, happy to be here.
It's great to have you. Trish is a poet and a literary arts advocate, and she runs a fantastic website. If you haven't tuned in as yet, please do, trishhopkinson.com. And there, for how many years now, you've been gathering all sorts of wonders. It's like a treasure trove for poets.
It's coming up on 6 years here.
Coming up on 6 years. What made you...
Just past 6 years, sorry.
You've just gone over 6 years.
Just gone over, yes. It's 2021, so yeah.
It's a real labor of love. I mean, you've got so much information. It's just to explain to people who haven't gone on there yet. Tell us a little bit about what people can find on your website.
Sure. So I really started, it was about the end of 2014. I started sharing things that I found about publishing poetry, how to get that done, and different literary magazines and how that market really works for poetry. And so on my site, I share interviews with editors, literary magazines where you can send your work off to get it published, other tips around that, where to find other resources to help you with your poetry, workshops, things of that nature. So
yeah, and there really is everything in terms of what I think of as, it's the time-honored way, isn't it, that a poet becomes discovered. You start sending out your work to the literary journals, maybe to some competitions. You hope that somebody is going to accept your poem and put it out there. I mean, there is this incredible network, isn't there, of literary journals. And each one is also, like your site, a labor of love. Have you seen any changes in that world over the 6 years that you've been doing this work?
Not really. I don't think a lot of big changes. There are certainly some literary magazines that come and go. Some of the new ones that come onto the scene do really, really well and continue to grow. And then occasionally they don't make it, right? And sometimes they end up going away because they don't have, all the support that they need. But there's some really great ones that, are relatively new, or if they've been around in print for a long time, they've all recognized that they need to be online in some capacity, right? So
Sure.
that shift started, probably a little bit before I really started building my blog up in 2014. A lot of markets were already moving online. So I think the majority of that shift happened just before I really started jumping in. But
great. So what we're going to be talking today is about how to get paid for your poetry. And this is something that you've, again, on your website, gone to a lot of trouble to research. No fee submission. Talk to me a bit about that and when you decided to do that. Was that, obviously that was a conscious choice, right?
Yes, early on, I started what I found is that a lot of the poets that are looking to really get published initially, they're emerging writers, right? So a lot of them are students, or, maybe this is just like you mentioned, it's a labor of love. So it's something that we do on the side, and you may not have the funds to invest in it or want to spend that money. And there's some additional risk there if you're paying $5 every time you send out poetry to have it published. And sometimes those literary magazines don't have the funding to pay that back to you. So it's really important to balance, the fees that you're paying with what you're going to get in return. And sometimes what you're going to get in return is some practice, being part of the literary community and really challenging yourself to write better, work on your craft, and get published in some of the more well-read literary magazines, or what we call top tier literary magazines. You have to start somewhere. So maybe you start submitting to, university journals and things like that to just get the experience and sort of understand how the system works for submitting. in which case, as you're just learning, you don't want to pay $3 here, $5 there, $10 here. Starts to add up pretty quickly. And there are so many places that you can submit without having to pay a fee. So I switched my focus to that pretty early. Initially, I was just kind of sharing different resources, and I was learning my own strategy. I didn't have a strategy yet. And I do have an article about submission strategy that you can find on my website to kind of help you navigate that some. But initially, not paying fees makes sense. And there are so many great markets. And down the road, there are some places I don't mind paying a fee, but I look at it as more of a donation to support the work that they're doing than as a reading fee where I, need to get something back in return. What you might get back is more that experience and getting your name out there, and the publication kudos, of course, can be good for a CV or for your own website and social media, right?
Great. So I was actually just going to turn to the whole website social media thing, because of course this is the other way to get out there now, which we didn't have before. So, the way you've just been talking about was the only way for a very long time. And in those days, there was no online, the journals were print, and so it was a pretty narrow audience. We're seeing now, and we've spoken to on this show, a number of people who are using social media in the most phenomenal way to build their following directly on Instagram and other social media platforms. And then from there, going on to publish their own chapbooks, and from there going on to publish their own collections, and not bothering at all with the submission process, not having that whole rejection cycle, saving the creative energy for the work itself. So talk to me a little bit about how the two systems compare. There are advantages and disadvantages to both ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is something to be said about being part of a community and contributing your work to that same community where, the traditional method of publication of poetry is to send it out to the lit mags and journals. But there are poets out there who are doing tremendous work on their own with self-publication. I think regardless, you need to build up your social media following. You need to contribute back to the community in some way so that other poets or poetry lovers know where to find you and also see what you're giving back. If you're always just posting, oh, look, a new poem, and it's not really giving anything back to the community in any way, then it'll be harder to build your followers. Self-promotion only goes so far. It's great if you can contribute something back to that community that you're asking for their support. And whether you're publishing traditionally or trying to sell your own published material, you really do need to build that network up, right? So you need it in both cases.
Absolutely. And I think, everybody who is doing well, you see that the poetry community is incredibly generous in terms of, they must be the most generous of the indies, and the indie author community is incredibly generous itself. So I think there is this whole thing of poetry as gift, really. I think of it as, there's a gift you're gifted with in terms of your ability with words, but it overflows, and poetry, more than any, it's that spontaneous overflow of feeling that was Wordsworth talked about, and more than any other art literary form, I think poetry is given as gift, the poem itself, and then that sense of connection among poets. So, sometimes to the degree that poets are uncomfortable with even the idea of being paid at all. Have you come across that?
I guess it really depends on what your goals are as a poet. Certainly if, financially that's not something that is a concern, or it's not part of your career plan. There are a lot of poets who are in education, who are teachers, professors, or, in that way, excuse me, using poetry more broadly as their financial means. But there certainly are some poets who really, they're just creating that art, and it's not something they rely on financially. Although it's always nice to get a little something in return. It never hurts to get paid and recognized for your art. I think, in the United States and then possibly in the UK as well. And excuse me, it varies from country to country how poets are valued. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to me. That's the literary advocacy part of what I do, is that, it's still art, and we put a lot of time and effort into our artwork, and it needs to be better recognized. And the having Amanda Gorman speak at Biden's inaugural and read a poem, I think, was a great boost for poetry. I know that she's seeing some substantial book sales, and I think that's fantastic news. I hope we continue to really support our poets in the US and in some of the other countries where it's not as recognized. And in the past, poets were considered just as important as a politician, and they were often, consulted and brought into political roles. And I would love to see a lot more of that.
Yes, I mean, that is something that has happened in traditional societies all the way up, and somewhere along the line poetry began to be seen as this kind of esoteric thing that's separate from real life, in inverted commas. And obviously the two, we don't subscribe to that.
Right.
So talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned your submission strategy. So back to the idea of sending out work and submitting to journals. It took you a while to work out your strategy. So maybe save some of the people here some time by talking about what you wish you knew then that you know now, and how do you handle it? How do you do it?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think if you're new to it, then certainly supporting university journals is a good way to get your feet wet and get some practice. But once you've done a few submissions and you've maybe gotten one or two acceptances, then you can start to look at, where do you think your work fits best? And are you ready to really challenge yourself? Because it does get more challenging, and it's a little bit trickier to get accepted by some of the literary magazines and journals that we consider top tier. I mean, I send to the New Yorker and Poetry every year. Maybe someday I will get accepted, but they get thousands and thousands of submissions. So they accept usually a fraction of a percent of the submissions that they get. So it's a lot more challenging, and you have to be willing to take those rejections, a lot more of them. So over time, as I've started to really aim higher and send my work out to some of those top tier magazines, I send there first. I wait for those rejections to come back, and then I start looking for some of the mid-tier, still well-read, but usually more specific literary journals and magazines that I think fits my work well. So one, I really love feminist-leaning journals and lit mags. I have a tendency to seek those out and send there. It kind of depends on, what your poetry is for, which, kind of what genre does it fit into? Do you do a lot of really experimental work? Then you'll want to look for those mid-tier literary magazines and journals that publish really experimental work, and you want to send there next. So I do it in those steps, but I did see that my acceptance percentage has gone down because I'm sending to the ones that are really tough to get into. And but it's worth that to me. I want to take a stab. I want to get the work out there to those that are really hard to get in, and take that gamble and be very patient. Let the work sit out there in a handful of those until they all come back and tell me no, which is basically what has happened to date. Someday, I'll get in one of those. I do believe that my work has the quality. But when there's so many, it's really hard for your work to stand out, or for your work to be the perfect fit for whatever they're trying to accomplish that issue. So it just gets more challenging I would say once you've gotten a few acceptances, if you're okay getting fewer acceptances for a while, then start sending out to those tougher journals and lit mags and see if maybe they might take a bite. But boy, you got to be patient and you got
Yes.
to be okay with the rejections. If those break your heart, don't aim quite so high. I've seen poets set goals of getting as much work published as they can. And they're still, selective where they send their work, but they're really trying to support some of those lit mags and journals that are doing great things, regardless of maybe how popular they are, or maybe it's a brand new one that's going to do really well. And you want to go ahead and support their efforts. Send to their very first issue. And then who knows, a few years from now, maybe they're really well read and they refer to you as being one of their inaugural poets. So there's lots of benefits to submitting to different levels of lit mags and journals.
It's so interesting when you talk about patience and rejection, because I think it's they are the two main reasons that authors generally and poets in particular go indie, because
Right.
they can't handle the rejection. Either it makes them, discourages them creatively, or just the whole process of the submission and the waiting and all of that they feel is creative energy that will be better spent putting together another poem or a chapbook or indeed a collection. And the other thing is patience. If you're
Right.
waiting to build up your poetry, I think of one of them as being a career and the other as being a business. And that's the way that's how it actually is, because once you publish a poetry book on Kindle or wherever, the day you sell your first one is, you've gone into business, whether you realize that or not.
Yeah.
Is it possible, do you think, to do some combination here? Or is it advisable even to, on the one hand, do your submissions so you're getting to know and you're, as you say, connecting with real people and supporting other people's, the Lit Mag efforts and so on, while also, putting out your poems and creating your own chapbooks and stuff? Is that possible? Because lots of them won't accept poetry if it's been published even on your own website. Isn't that right?
Yes, yeah. Typically, they want and I do have a whole list of literary magazines and journals that will accept reprints. So that is one avenue that you can go if you are publishing your own work in your own chapbooks or online books or on your website, however it is that you're promoting it, or through social media. Those certainly can be put in lit mags and journals who are willing to accept reprints. Keeping in mind that very few of those actually do offer a payment for a reprint publication. There are some that do, but it's not super common. Most of the lit mags and journals want to be the first ones to put it out there, and usually those rights revert back to you, so you can then publish later on, either in your own indie publication or through a place that accepts reprints. So there's opportunities for that 100%. And, some of these poets who are really doing a great job in the indie space are prolific, which is why they don't want to wait, right? Because they write 2 or 3 chapbooks or a book a year or maybe more. If you're really prolific and you're putting out a lot of work, you may want to say, okay, this work, I'm not sure if this is going to turn into a book, so I'm going to start sending these poems out to lit mags and journals. Once those get published, then you can share them on your social media, that's the approach I take, right? So I share my work as, oh, here's a piece that was just published. And that's how I promote it, is once it's already been published, then I can go ahead and share it freely. And those rights have reverted back to me. So that's my method of doing it. Certainly you could create whole collections that you publish on your own. But for traditional presses, they typically are fine having, up to about 50% of the individual poems being published in lit mags and journals that are part of a book or a collection. They're okay with about half usually being published prior to the book's release. So there's a lot you can do to juggle that. And certainly if you're producing a lot of work, there's no reason why you can't do an indie publication, a chapbook, or your own full length, while still sending, other pieces out to other places to see how that turns out. And I've
Sure.
seen, a lot of indie poets will put work out on Instagram, then they'll create a collection, they'll indie publish that, and then their next book, they're like, I want to see if someone else will publish me. So then they really start sending work out and kind of going that direction. But either way, you're your own publicist if you're a poet. You need to build that network. So if you build a great network and you can sell your own books, by all means, go for it. There are still some poets out there that think, that's not as great as being published by a press or by a literary magazine, but it's much more accepted now. I don't think, poets that are out there really trying to be part of the community, they're not getting looked down on by most.
Yeah, I agree. There is a big change there. And I think, poets come in two types. There are those who really do like and need the validation of somebody else saying this is good work, and there are those for whom that's not half as important as the reader following, the people who, they're looking out at the readership, whereas the others are maybe looking up at somebody who's kind of, it's a kudos, and there is no right or wrong way. And indeed, as we were saying, do both. It doesn't have to be either or. It's entirely, you write your own script here, just as you write your own poems. So you spoke about the tiers, and you spoke about acceptance falling off. Obviously, the higher you pitch, the fewer acceptances you get. You get paid more, though, presumably. So your income from your poetry may not necessarily go down by pitching higher. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I would say that's probably true. I mean, a lot of the smaller and university journals, they might offer a little bit of a payment. A lot of places aren't able to offer any payment. And so, yeah, if your goal is really to try to balance, to say, okay, I would like to see this much come in based on my work and efforts creatively, then you probably want to branch out a little bit. I've seen poets who publish their own work and then they branch out. They open like little online bookstores where they feature other poets and they make some profit that way. They teach workshops. They offer editing services, things along those lines to really, make sure that they're bringing in a little bit of income. So they do tend to turn it into more of a business instead of relying just on the creative work, but finding other ways to, get paid for what they've learned and what they can offer.
Sure. Now, all of this takes time, whichever way you go, either or both. And you do all of this, and you also have a full-time job, I found out, which I was really surprised to hear, because you are very prolific. I mean, your blog goes out almost daily. I know you have lots of guest posts on your blog, but still, I know what it takes to have a blog that's that consistent and regular. So can you give some tips to people about balancing their time, especially around, there's the writing part, but how do you balance that with all the submission and a little bit about submission tracking, how to keep track of it all?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So the way I used to be a lot more regimented. Like I had very specific routines where I would post on my blog at the same time every day. And, what I learned is that I have to be more flexible. My day job got, more and more demanding. And so the way I manage my time now is really just I have a list of things that I would like to get to, right? And typically those are prioritized. There will be a few things at the top, deadlines that I don't want to miss for submitting, for example, or, blog posts that have, some date requirements that I want to make sure I get done. So those are at the top. And then as far as the creative energy, writing new work versus submitting and other things along those lines, I usually just do whatever I feel like doing. Some days writing new work, you're just not in that headspace. And that's when I submit, or revise. Maybe I want to do some revision work because there's just right now, I just don't have the energy or I don't have the ideas to put pen to paper. So that's typically how I do it. I have my list, and then what do I feel like doing? That's what I'm going to be most effective at. So those are the things that I do first. But there are other things that you can do that I think, work for some of the poets I engage with on a regular basis. So a lot of them do Submission Sunday, for example, and they're like, okay, every Sunday I'm going to do at least one submission, and other people will say, well, I'm going to do 10 a week. So you can set specific goals for yourself. But, you also have to be kind to yourself. And if it didn't work out for some reason, you just, you change it around, or you decide, maybe you've got a great idea for a poem and you need to spend time being creative, then you don't submit that day. So it really is about being kind to yourself, picking the things that you're going to be most successful at, depending on how you're feeling, I think is the best way to get it done.
Lovely. Flexibility for flow kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a comment from Becky Myers. Oh my God, if Trish has a full-time job on top of everything she does, this means I have no excuse. Face palm.
We all need excuses. We all need excuses. We all have a lot going on. And, all of those things have to be balanced, and you can't be beating yourself up. I'm actually a pretty slow writer. I don't produce a ton of poetry. I've discovered that trying to push myself to do, that what happens is I'm not happy with the work. So I really wait to be inspired. I look at prompts and I go to workshops and other things to keep myself writing, because I have to have those little nudges to push me along. I think otherwise I'd probably write a poem a month if I was lucky. Sometimes that's all I do. So, we all go at our own pace, and yeah, no face palming.
No face palming allowed, Becky. You're doing fine. And folks, if you have a question for Trish, please do get it into us, because we're coming towards the end of the show. She will be back, however, for the next 2 months, when we're going to be diving a little bit more deeply into various themes around self-publishing poetry. So yeah, but if you have a question for her today, particularly on submission for payments, then please do drop that into the chat now. So yeah, when you were starting out, and when you look back on, talk to us a little bit about your poetry biography, as it were. When did you start writing poetry, and at what point did it become serious for you?
I think I always thought it was serious. But that was really before I took any university courses on poetry. So I'm a non-traditional student. I started my day job career in my early 20s, and really didn't go back to college. And well, I did it very, very gradually. I didn't finish my bachelor's in creative writing until the end of 2013. So that's when I got my degree. I was well into my career in software at that point, and so I always thought that I was a serious poet, but I really didn't understand a lot of the aspects of, really revision and craft. I had a little bit of talent that kept me writing since I was very young, and I had always written poetry. I think, by the time I was in my early 20s, I probably had written about 1,000 poems that I had in stacks of paper and typed, and some on the computer. And but it wasn't until I really took my first creative writing class in college that I started to understand what the craft really meant, and how to really become serious about it. And so that's when I really, started sending out for publication, started understanding what it took to get published. And that's when the whole blog and all of that sort of came together for me at that same point.
And if you look back at that starting point of it really becoming more than just personal, enjoyment and so on, Is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners about, you know, the mistakes you made at the beginning that you would unmake now, or do you have a top tip as to what they should or shouldn't do as a step forward and, you know, aim to grow their poetic output, but also to get paid for their poetry?
Yeah, don't be afraid to revise your work. I think it's so important to, go back. I mean, there's something to being an artist to saying, well, this is what I first created, but really digging in and we, you and I talked a little bit about comparing, right? Not necessarily to compare your work to other poets, but then you do need to see what's being published out there and what are the types of work that readers are really enjoying. And, little things like just making sure you don't have cliches in your poetry, or that you're really using some of the important poetic devices, sound, and making sure that your word choice is perfect. Spending time revising is one of my most favorite things about the craft of poetry. And so I think that's the biggest mistake that I see with beginning poets, is that they feel like they've put this beautiful thing out into the world, and that they don't want to, that any kind of change to it would be not honoring the art. And everybody has their own beliefs. I believe it's the opposite, that you're not honoring the art unless you really attend to it and give it, all that attention and detail, and make sure to make it the very best that it can be. So that would be, I think, what I would tell beginners.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more personally. For me, writing is editing. That's
Yeah.
that second process is what makes a writer. Writers are people who find writing harder than other people, somebody said once. And I think that, yeah, I think it's very true. And if you look at the manuscripts of the great poets who've come down to us from other, eras, or across to us from other countries and territories, who are people who have broken out enough to transcend, their own time or place, which is a sign that they speak to a lot of people. You see that the work has been revised again and again. You see all those scratched out manuscripts, in that time, you're able to see the story of the poem coming together, and something that seems completely effortless, you see that there was huge effort
Right.
behind it. Yeah. So just a couple of questions to finish off. Becky again, she's just starting out and she has just begun submitting poems over the past few months. She's finding it hard to figure out how many places to send one poem at a time. Any suggestions or guidelines on how much do you flog one piece before you give it a rest?
Yes, no, that's an awesome question. So I usually don't like to send out to more than, like, say, 5 or 6 different literary magazines for a single poem. Sometimes they're in packets with different poems, they're grouped together depending on what I think that literary magazine will take. But I will tell you, there are pros and cons to that. If you send out a poem to, let's say, 20 different places and it gets accepted, now you have 19 other places to tell it's been accepted and you need to withdraw it. And that work, while it's exciting, is a lot of busy work. And I think, there is some people believe in that shotgun approach. I'm just going to send out to as many places as possible. That's one way to do it. I think it's better use of your time to try to zero in a little bit if you can. Certainly you don't need to read, 12 issues of every journal to get a feel for whether or not your work will fit. But I usually wouldn't send a poem out more than 5 or 6 times at the same time, those simultaneous submissions. But I have sent poems out. Like, I had one that finally got accepted that I had sent out 31 times before it got accepted. So keep trying, keep sending them out. You see the little quotes and stuff about these famous writers who, sent their book out. They got rejected 100 times. And it's because it's not about the quality of the work. It's about it being the right fit for that publication or for that press. And sometimes it's hard to find it. I mean, there are thousands out there.
Sure. Okay, we're going to end on that hopeful note and say thank you to Trish for coming in and sharing her expertise. As I said, she's going to be here for the next 2 months. And so I think next month we're going to have a pure Q&A session where we will gather in questions from our own poetry readers and writers for you. And then, so if any of you have particular questions that you would like Trish to address or us to research in the meantime, so we could go a little bit more deeply into some of your questions than is possible on the live stream, just on the fly, then please do send those through to info@ornaross.com. And Sarah will pick them up from there, collate them for us, and send them through to Trish and myself.
Awesome.
So thank you, Trish. That was great. Thank you so much. Are you off to work now?
Yeah, I'm back to this was my lunch hour essentially, and I'm headed back to work. But no, this was a great break in my workday, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions. I mean, those could turn into blog posts,
Absolutely. So, yeah. I predict that they will somehow. Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you very much for giving up your lunch hour for this. I didn't realize that was how it was happening. It was a great chat, and we'll see you again.
Great.
We'll see you again next month.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone. Keep writing, keep publishing.